Okay,
It's a
so
question. Yeah,
where would you place Herland on the E spectrum? Who'd like to go first?
I can go.
Okay.
So I was kind of in between the center of the E spectrum and none, so the one. And I I think I was more towards one because I feel like between like emulation and conquest, the inhabitants of Hairland, I think it is, Hairland,
Yeah.
they didn't seek to like expand their territory or conquer other lands, but they also didn't seek to like emulate or adopt cultural practices, I felt like too, or like different societies. But I feel like it's their society is like a utopian society that exists with isolation from the rest of the world. So I don't know. I feel like they just had no interest in expanding their society beyond or converting their society at all, besides like into outsiders, but they preferred to just maintain their way of life and protect it. So that's why I said a one on the spectrum. What did you guys think?
Yeah, I also put a one. I think there was a quote on page 12. It said there was no way up or down or out. They simply had to stay there. That's just describing like the specific area that they had to kind of have to themselves. So I think that there's an aspect of that they kind of had to do it by like they were forced into the fact that they were kind of isolated. They didn't really
Yeah.
have much to expand upon besides the country that they had to themselves. And so when they're talking with the scientists and the researchers, they want to understand what the current culture is like. However, they're not kind of acclimating to that and they're not changing anything about their society. So they're not necessarily emulating anything from them. I think that they just want to have an aspect of learning and knowledge about it. And so that's kind of why I definitely veered towards the none side. But there wasn't like absolutely zero expansion because they obviously expanded throughout their entire country and their agriculture was definitely very advanced. And so for that reason, I felt that they had at least a little bit of expansion, but definitely not like a conquest or anything like that.
Yeah, on top of what you were saying, Isaac, I think like I also had a one also. And I think one of the driving factors for them not wanting to expand was like kind of their lack of conflict, like in their society. Like on page 15, it said they had no enemies. They themselves were all sisters and friends. The land was fair before them, and a great future began to form itself in their minds. And so, like usually one of the driving factors for expansion, on top of like greed and that sort of thing, is kind of attack your enemies and conquer them before they're able to conquer you. And like the quote was saying, since they had no enemies, they really had no reason to do that. So I think that was also one of the great reasons why they didn't really have any need to really expand, at least land wise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I think all our answers were like pretty similar too for that one. Yeah.
Right.
Give me 1 second. I got to pull the question back up. Okay, so where did you guys rate it for the S? Or yeah, the S.
So for me, I think I said for the S spectrum, it was more towards equality. So five, I think it was. And I just said this because I feel like they were very committed to like a social and economic equality for all the members in their society. And I feel like they kind of like eliminated that concept of like private property and they shared all their resources equally among like everyone. And that can include like food, clothing, housing, all of that. And they also did not, I think it was in this text that they didn't have like a monetary system, something like that, or like a concept of paid labor. And instead, everyone just like works for the good of the community and they received all like the necessary resources they need for a comfortable life. So that's why I said more towards five, equality.
Yeah, I agree. I was kind of debating between four and five on the socioeconomic scale. I ended up going with four, but I feel like you can also go with five. There really isn't too much variance. Um, but basically, I based off of a quote on page 16, and it said, they were sisters, and as they grew together, not by competition, but by united action. And I feel like that perfectly highlights the fact that they're all in it together. There's no element of competition. There's no elected leaders. There's no higher ups in their society, really. They are all one alike. And they're all contributing, but contributing equally. And that is a big aspect of their society. So I think that equality, much, much more than liberty.
Yeah, so I also had five, and again, to build off of what Isaac was saying, since they kind of got rid of this whole concept of private property and wealth and ownership and all that, it was very evident, like throughout the text, that there was no like divisions of classes, and everyone was kind of on an equal playing ground. And I think this was especially prevalent since one of the quotes was that at least in referring to when the scientists were talking to the women, they said that at least a third of your women are poor, and they were questioning like what is this wage earners, and they are all poor. What is poor exactly? So, and I think again this perfectly highlights this concept of since they have this complete lack of wealth and property that they don't even understand, like they can't grasp this concept of poor, which I think is also makes sense as to why they would be put at a five on the S spectrum.
And to go off
Yeah.
what you were saying too, I totally forgot about this, but like they also had like their society was based on the principle of like complete gender equality. So I like what you were saying, there's no like distinctions between men and women in terms of like social or economic goals and everything. So they had like equal access to everything like education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and just stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, I just one last thought, just another aspect of the equality was the fact that none of them had any last names. And so
Yeah.
it extremely limits the amount of individualism that you're allowed to have in that type of society, but it
Mhm.
also kind of highlights and brings up the aspect of equality, and everyone's on that level playing field. There's no real variance because you don't even have a last name. So
That's a good point. So comparing the text one and three.
I think it was, is that the eugenics crusade, like the
yeah,
PBS one? Okay.
That was the eugenics video.
And then um, what did I say? So for these two, so like the eugenics crusade, I think, and the Hurlin one, I said they present like opposite views of society and human nature because I felt like I feel like they both addressed the topics of eugenics, but they had like very different perspectives of it because the PBS documentary, I think, yeah, I explored more of like the dark history of eugenics in the US and its like implementation throughout forced like sterilization and other things, while the other text presented more of like a fictional society almost that like achieved biological and like social perfection. Um, but I feel like they both raised questions to me about like the ethics and like implications of attempts to almost engineer like a genetic makeup of like human population. So I feel like they were both like we're talking they were obviously both talking about the same concept, but like had very different perspectives about it. If that makes sense.
yeah, I would perfectly agree. That's, I mean, basically took the words out of my mouth. They have varying perspectives, but they're talking about the same thing. And the big thing that I took from the video was that the Dr. Laughlin, I forget his first name, but I just remember that
Mhm.
his name was Laughlin. Um, a lot of his ideas were extremely comparable and similar to Hitler. And that is obviously a very extreme scenario, an extreme comparison. And then when you compare that with the Herlin text, they obviously take a much lighter approach to this aspect of eugenics. And I think that there is no aspect of sterilization in regards to the eugenics of Herland. And I
Yeah.
think basically the video touches upon more extreme aspects of eugenics, and then lighter aspects of eugenics are touched upon in Herland.
Yeah, I mean, again, you guys are saying pretty much and covering everything that I was going to go over. But yeah, I think one of the key differences besides the obvious ideological differences is in the PBS video and throughout our actual history, we actively pursued this idea of eugenics, through sterilization and all that. Whereas in Herland, one quote on page 29 said, if this idea of evolution is so, then our improvement must be due either to mutation or solely to education. And to me, this means that they're obviously not at all like looking to improve themselves genetically. It's just kind of naturally happening through either their education system or just through how nature's working. So yeah, um, I think it is just a grave difference between the two.
Yeah, just one last thing. I on page 25, I don't have a direct quote, it's kind of more a paraphrase, but Herland is more touching upon improving like the quality of human being and not necessarily cutting back on it. And the aspect of the video is more focusing on cutting back specifically on the population. So there's an aspect of quality over quantity, basically.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So comparing text 2 and 3 and including motherhood and eugenics in your discussion.
Okay. So those were looking backward and Berlin, but
Yep.
I feel like they both presented very like alternative visions of society, but they differed in their emphasis on motherhood and eugenics. So I feel like looking backwards envisioned more of a society where the role of woman is like primarily of that of like mothers and like responsible for raising and educating children who will be leaders of the nation. And eugenics is not, I felt like it wasn't mentioned like explicitly, but implied through the ideas of like efficiency and achieved through like the elimination of poverty and disease. And in contrast, I felt like the Berlin text like rejects the traditional gender roles and it almost like relegates that woman in like the domestic sphere instead of like presenting a society where motherhood is like a shared responsibility, if that makes sense. And like how eugenics in that text is also explicitly rejected as a form of oppression and like an affront to human dignity almost. But I feel like both texts offered kind of like an alternative vision of society where like Herland was much more progressive in its rejections. I think, I don't know. That's what I felt about the two.
Yeah, I think that this was much more difficult to compare to
Yeah.
Herland compared to the video. Um, because there was so far and few mentions of like eugenics and motherhood, specifically in the second text. A couple of things that I drew were how exactly the two perspectives approach eugenics and motherhood. And so in text two, it's not necessarily focused upon as much as it is in society like Herland. In society like Ireland, it's the main focus, it's the main identity of their people being a mother. Whereas in the second text, it's not necessarily touched upon as much, which I think in itself is representative of the prioritization of being a mother in that specific society. In regards to eugenics, I think the way that they approach it and the way that they tackle the issue is completely separate, where there is no attempt to tackle the issue in the second text. And they specifically mentioned that there was separate jobs reserved for separate genders of humans. And the jobs that required more manual intense labor were reserved for the men and opposites for the woman. And I think that basically highlights the fact that there was no aspect of trying to integrate eugenics into this and try to tackle that issue. Whereas in Herland, they obviously try to tackle that issue with education of the varying sciences that are within their society. And yeah, that was really all I had about it.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with you guys how it's like it's again it's like it's differing ideologies but kind of from a different viewpoint. Like in terms of the motherhood thing, like as you were saying, Isaac, how this idea of motherhood in Herland is considered, it's like sacred. It's like considered like above all else the most important aspect of their society. I don't quite remember where in the text it said, but they even compared it to like a religious sacrament at some point, which really highlights just how much they really how much they treasure it. Um, in terms of motherhood in the second text, I didn't find much either. But one thing I did find was that how again how you were saying with each job is kind of specifically engineered to be perfect for the individual. And one of the like this idea of motherhood only really comes up in a woman's life when she's somewhat or more or less exhausted her work environment or what she's been doing, and she's looking to like take on a new task or new challenge. And even when she does take upon this challenge like upon herself, no matter how long she's gone for, she's still accepted with open arms when she's looking to return to the workforce, and it's as if she never left. And in terms of the eugenics, Isaac, again, I agree with you. How it's instead of how in our world in our history, rather than kind of cutting down and removing all the indesirables and trying to make this entire population conform to this one viewpoint. In the second text, they instead they kind of they build their whole structure of the workforce around this idea of differences, and through that they they tailor these jobs, for each individual person, and they kind of, in that sense, they kind of, that's how they tackled the whole idea of eugenics.
Yeah.
Anything else anyone wants to add?
Not really. I mean, kind of covered all the bases. So
Yeah, I agree. All right.